Hey there. Comfortably in my work chair slash armchair slash recliner slash TV chair, etc. One of my favorite places to do these virtual things. It's going to be a rather long one. Um, so hang in there. And there potentially can be interruptions if my dog comes around in here or a family member who forgets that I'm in here doing this. So bear with me if there's a pause in the action. Uh, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just waiting till the disruption leaves. I want to talk uh, with you about something we talked about in class already, but it's important enough that it can be talked about again, and that's culture and temperament. We talked about temperament, but I'm going to go over it again because this is a foundation. I mentioned imprinting. I told you the story about Lorenz and the ducks. Uh, and I left out a part intentionally about bonding. And I'm not really going to go deeply into bonding. Bonding occurs at birth, but it's not instantaneous. The old information thought that bonding was instantaneous. It's not. It's not instantaneous at all. It's occurs over time. Okay, had a pause there for a minute. Sorry, and I don't know what I was talking about. Bonding. Yeah, anyway, bonding is between significance. You can bond with significant others. You can bond with um, most anybody that takes care of you. You can bond with your friends. You can bond with most anybody. It's effectual, um, not the right word, an affectionate bond. So normally we look at mother and child, father and child, etc. They can be with anyone, and it's lifelong. An imprint is short-lived. Bonding is lifelong. So you bond with your mom, you bond with your dad, and whoever you're closest with is who you most closely bond with. So that's all I'm going to tell you about bonding at the moment. I want to go into this developmental process because that's what we're talking about. This isn't developmental psychology, but this section is. So this affected by culture. So what I want to begin with is a discussion about something that I really don't think you've heard of unless you've been reading the assigned readings, and that's called developmental contextualism. Uh, Developmental contextualism, by definition, is, by the way, is new. It's contemporary. It's currently the term of the day, really. It's a theoretical perspective. And what it says is that there are multiple levels in a child's development in each developmental period. So if you look at Piaget and his cognitive development theory, and Erickson and his psychosocial developmental theory, so on and so forth, others, Vygotsky, so on and so forth, they're not looking at this contextualism aspect, excuse me, of development. So what this does is it's almost like the biopsychosocial view of things, the biology of something, the psychology of something, the sociology of something, and that's taken into account here. So we're looking at biological, psychological, social, relational, and I won't go really into a great deal of detail about social, relational, and socio-cultural. All of these things are tied together in your developmental process. What's the point? Well, this all has to do with how you're going to react to and deal with the culture that you find yourself in at birth. Obviously, you're not going to have the ability at that young of an age to make assessments, but over time, that will come. And at birth, you are born with something that I told you about in class, temperament. And the various types of temperament. There are three major types. There are actually more than these three, but these are the three majors. There are variations on each one. What is temperament? Just to go over it again, it's the qualities of responsiveness that are displayed by a child, and they begin at birth, and it's basically a view of your reactions to situations. It's biologically based, and its reference is the rest of the world. So, how do I react to what's going on around me? And if you remember from class, we talked about the three major types: easy, difficult, which I also told you is called now feisty. I prefer difficult because it's more descriptive, and slow to warm up. A slow to warm up child, for example, is not some challenged, cognitively challenged child, is somebody that's shy. Simple word that means the same thing as slow to warm up, shy, and usually outgrow it. So easy temperament, low demanding, not a high demanding child. Put them in the floor with their toys, they play all day. Difficult, put them in the floor and they scream all day. Pick them up and they still scream. Difficult temperament, can't satisfy them. I'm not talking about things like colicky or chronic things. I'm talking about just their disposition. You can't please them. And then again, slow warm up, shy, grow out of that. Now, a fourth thing came into play, and that fourth thing was not an original part of the studies done by Thomas and Chess. This fourth thing came about later, after studies were done with this easy, difficult, and slow warm up business. It's not that cut and dried. You can't just say, okay, they're easy, so boom, they don't need anything. Oh, they're difficult, so they're never happy. And of course, that's not reality. So, what was causing this disruption in the way people received these descriptions of their children? Well, I got a feisty child, but my child doesn't give me a lot of trouble. It was called goodness of fit. How do you respond to your child's temperament? And how does your child respond to your way of addressing their temperament? And then the newer studies went even further, and they said, you have expectations of a child's behavior. Well, guess what? They have expectations of yours. It's just not as sophisticated. They're too young. But they do have expectations. I'm hungry. I expect you to feed me. I'm cold. I expect you to get me warm. Whatever the case is. So they're going to have expectations, and then as they grow older, you're also going to input values. So those factor into expectations. And those are the cultural things, the values. What are the values? How do they fit into this temperament business? It can get very confusing. Um, Obviously, there's work being done, research, and other things being done in a way of studying what this goodness of fit business is all about. How do we alter a temperament, for example? Can we alter a child's temperament? Right now, the belief is that maybe the concrete fact doesn't exist as far as when we respond, how can we respond in a way that will help us change a child's temperament if we want their temperament to change. Now, let's throw some more mud in the works. This is good, but we're talking about Western culture here. We're not the only culture that exists on this planet. So, thus, cross-cultural psychology. We have to apply this across cultural lines. There is a question, and the question is this: are there implications in terms of a cross-cultural look at temperament? And the answer is, kinda, probably are, but really, because biology is biology. Nature is nature. So when you're born, just because you're born in Japan or in Africa or Guadalajara or wherever you're born, does that automatically mean that you're going to have a different biology when it comes to things like temperament? And the answer right now is probably not, but there's no concrete evidence. I would suggest to you, strongly suggest to you, that we can, by and large, say that a child in China biologically is the same as a child born to an Eskimo family in Alaska. How are you going to change that biology when it comes to temperament? We don't understand it deeply enough yet to be able to answer that um, unequivocally. So the idea that culture plays a role, and it does, would come after the fact. Biology not being affected, but behavior being affected. I hope that makes sense. So here's the significance. Child born to Asian parents, child born to, let's call them American parents, for lack of a better term. It could be anything, African American, Latino American, it doesn't matter. American, Western, that better. Okay, how's that? So, Western culture family. The difference in culture will have the effect that I'm talking about. The expectations of the culture. For instance, in an Asian culture, the idea is that a lower responding child is a desirable child, whereas in Western culture, a lower responding child doesn't fit our cultural expectations of a child's behavior. So if I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it. And the demands that you make on me and that I make on you are going to be different than this Asian family's demands. The expectations are different. Hope you understand that, because that's probably one of the two bigger points of this whole thing. Learning your culture, learning what the culture expects from you, and then learning how to fulfill that expectation. Now, leads me into the second part of this, and I'll make this brief. And I talked somewhat briefly about this. I think I may have missed this. I may have mentioned this in my developmental class. Actually, this whole thing may have been developmental, but it fits into cross-cultural because that's what this section wants to address for you. So let's move from temperament and let's move into what's called attachment. Temperament is a factor in attachment. What is attachment? It's an effectual bond. Remember me talking about bonds a moment ago? Well, the reason I brought it up is because I wanted to precursor this, if that's even a word to be used properly, what I'm going to talk about now. Attachment. What is attachment? It's an effectual bond. It's a special bond that develops between the infant and their primary caregiver. Notice we don't just say mom. Psychology prefers the term primary caregiver because you may not have been raised by your mom, your birth mom. You may have been raised in an adoption situation. You may have been raised by a grandparent, an aunt, uncle, a cousin, whatever the case is. Your primary caregiver who takes care of you most of the time. And I won't get into discussions about daycares and things like that. That's for developmental psychology. So this bond develops whether you want it to or not, it does. There's no mention here, by the way, of love. There is a mention of affection. And if you want to get really involved with that, you can. We're going to use it for kind of meaning one and the same thing. So attachment and the quality of it has long-term effects on your future relationships. Secure attachment. Two major categories. Secure attachment. A secure attached child is a child who is warm and responsive because their caregiver is warm and responsive to them. They take care of the child's needs. And children understand that by the age of 1, it's well established. Yes, that young. They know whether you're going to be dependable or not as their caregiver. If you're not dependable, then they don't develop a secure attachment. They develop an insecure attachment. And an insecure attachment has two major categories, and then a third was added later. I won't go into it at the moment. It's a mixture. So let's talk about the two biggies under the heading insecure attachment. Plug in a word called ambivalent. Ambivalent attachment. children who are ambivalently attached to their caregiver are uncertain about the responses that they're going to receive from their caregiver. I'm going to say mother because it's easier than caregiver, but we're talking about caregivers. But let's just say mom. Let's use mom as the example. How's that? So they're going to be going back and forth with the mom. At some moments, they reject the mother slash caregiver, and other times they seek out the mother for care. And the reason it's like that is because they don't get they're not receiving boy, I'm struggling for a good word to use. The care that they receive is ambivalent. Some days it's good, some days it's bad. How does that sound? That's not really the way I want to describe it, but that's basically in essence what it is. So this is consistent. There we go. The care is not consistent. It's inconsistent in that needs are maybe met one day and the next day you're ignored. Talking about the infant slash child now. So that's one major style. The other is called avoidant. An avoidant attachment on the part of the child means that there's a total rejection of the caregiver. And that comes about because the caregiver hasn't been giving care, simple as pie. So if I don't have a secure attachment, I'm going to suffer these other two attachments and the things that go along with that. Now, and it affects the developmental process. What's the cross-cultural part of this? The cross-cultural part is simply this. As you probably have recognized by now, we're trying to establish the fact that culture is comparative. And that's what we're doing in this course, is making these comparisons. So here's a good example of that. I've talked to you briefly about bonding. I've talked to you about attachment. I've talked about temperament, and then talked to you about the cross-cultural ideas about temperament. Well, attachment's the same. Uh, can we make comparisons across cultures? And the answer is yes, because children receive care all over the world. Now, if you're in a country where the caregiver is constantly making efforts to simply survive, where there's not much in the way of food, clean water, medication, etc., then your attachment's going to be a little bit different. I think you can see that. Temperament would play a role in that. The attachment is going to be a more important role because you have to compare what you would expect in this country for care to a country where you struggle to survive. I hope that makes sense. In other words, the priorities are different. That affects the attachment, and it becomes an expectation. So, yes, this crosses culture. The way it crosses, maybe I should say the consequences of the way it crosses may be different because of the circumstances. It's a little complicated, but I think you get the point. So, we can say, yes, that temperament and attachment exist all over the world, but they don't exist in the same way. Why not? Because the cultures are different. It's that simple. What I expect in this culture out of my parents and vice versa may not be the same as the specifics in another culture, but in general, the needs are there. I hope that makes your day. I hope your attachment is secure. I'll be back with you next week. This is the last lecture for this week, and have a good weekend.